In later paintings, the ball with the grapevine garter looks almost innocent. The hall, candles, adult ladies in heavy dresses, knights in bright surcoats, light on polished metal. A blue ribbon seems to fall from a woman's foot in the crowd. The guests notice it. Embarrassment turns into laughter. The king bends down to pick it up, and the awkward gesture becomes legendary. Outside this imaginary hall, at the same time, fields lie covered with the dead at Crécy. Bodies rot in the moats at Calais. Plague sweeps through the cities, and taxes rise to pay for the English king's foreign crown. Greetings. This is a story about how a convenient spicy myth was woven around the Order of the Garter, and what was really behind this symbol in the time of Edward III. It is about how the later story of the Countess of Salisbury's Garter covered up the creation of a closed military club, where members swore not to courtly love, but to support the royal war. Write in the comments which city and country you are from, and whether you have ever heard the version about an awkward episode at a ball as the source of the order. Share what other romantic legends about power seem suspiciously convenient to you. I wish you attentive and anxious listening. Beyond the beautiful ribbon, dirty politics will be visible. The later legend is simple. At a court celebration in Calais, a noble lady's garter supposedly slips off her foot. The adult men and women present begin to laugh. The king picks up the ribbon and utters a phrase in Old French, the meaning of which boils down to the fact that it is not she who should be ashamed, but those who see this as filth. This phrase became the motto of the new order, and the garter became its symbol. Detailed versions mentioning the name of the Countess of Salisbury appeared only many decades after the order was founded, in the texts of humanists and court writers who referred not to documents but to ancient tales. Between the real political decision of the mid-14th century and these retellings lies an entire human life. Sources from the time of Edward III are different. They are silent about the ball and the awkward gesture, but they talk about war, taxes, and the elite. Edward lays claim to the French crown, includes foreign lilies in his coat of arms, wins battles, ravages provinces, and keeps Calais in a starving siege. His reign is a series of conscription drives, heavy taxes, and confiscation of property from those considered insufficiently loyal. The men he gathered around him were not characters from a courtly romance, but adult commanders with burned villages, broken bones, lost eyes, and chronic infections from wounded campaigns behind them. In this reality, an elite order is needed not to celebrate a random garter, but to bind together people who control violence. The garter itself in the 14th century was not necessarily an intimate detail of women's clothing. It was a belt or ribbon used to fasten parts of armor. Such a belt could easily be turned into a visible sign of belonging to a club. It could be sewn on, worn on the leg, and displayed in battle and at ceremonies. It is reminiscent not of a countess's leg, but of a belt that tightens metal around the body and connects a knight to his role. The motto of the order is expressed in the language of the highest nobility, and it can be read not only as a defense of the lady from ridicule, but also as a response to those who see only evil and usurpation in Edward's claims. In this reading, shame is attributed to those who accuse the king of usurpation, and the garter becomes a marker of agreement with his version of legitimacy. From the very beginning, the Order of the Garter was conceived as a small circle. It included the king, his heir, several dozen selected knights and magnates, whose names are known from the lists, relatives of the monarch, military leaders, and large landowners. For each of them, admission meant special clothing, a place in processions, proximity to the royal body, and the right to advise and petition. But at the same time, it meant the obligation to support the king in his endeavors, to appear at war, to bring their troops, and to vote as required in councils. In St. George's Chapel, associated with the order, prayers are said for victories, for the health of the ruler, for the success of campaigns, for the retention of Calais, and not for the honor of a lady in the hall, which is not mentioned in the documents. The later myth about the spicy origins of the order becomes a convenient mask. It distracts attention from the fact that this structure was an instrument of discipline within a class of people accustomed to deciding the fates of others. It allows one to talk about garters without recalling the broken bodies and black buboes of the plague that occurred during the same reign. The city crowd and later readers cling to a simple picture: a grown king, an awkward gesture, a lady's honor saved. Behind this picture, taxes, requisitions, punitive raids, and the need to keep the elite from rebelling with the help of status and symbols disappear. This is the main difference between myth and document. Where rumors promise a light anecdote, the papers show the cold mechanism of loyalty, tied not around the leg of the Countess of Salisbury, but around the entire military class, which, together with the king, will have to pay with their lives for the politics of his ambitions. The Order of the Garter did not arise in a vacuum. Edward III lived in a world where the rulers of Europe had already realized that crowns and coats of arms alone were not enough to keep the knightly elite in obedience. In France, in neighboring principalities, and in the states of the German princes, circles of the chosen were created, alliances of the best warriors and aristocrats. They gathered at tournaments, sat next to the Lord, and received special honors. In such an environment, the new English order became a response to a common challenge: to unite those who could raise armed men, not only through fear of punishment, but also through a common legend, a common fabric, a common enamel on their shields. Sources on the early Order of the Garter show how this structure gradually became overgrown with rituals. Windsor became the center of a special topography of honor. A chapel was built there, shields with coats of arms hung there, and each member of the order had his own place there. This is not a picture from romantic illustrations, but a very specific scheme. Who stands where in the choir, whose place has a more honorable view of the altar, whose coats of arms are next to each other, and whose are the first to catch the eye. Coats of arms are sometimes removed as punishment for betrayal or falling out of favor, sometimes redrawn to reflect new titles and territories. Each such gesture is silent, but speaks louder than short orders. The one whose shield has disappeared is no longer part of the inner circle. The one whose colors hang above the chair is still needed by the king. This system, built of wood, stone, and paint, coexists with the much harsher reality of war. At the time the order is formed, the English army is using tactics of devastating raids on French territories. Cavalry and archers move through villages and towns, burning grain stores, stealing livestock, and slaughtering those who resist. In chronicles written from the English perspective, this is referred to as raids of destruction, and described as a necessary strategy to deprive the enemy of resources. In accounts from the other side, it looks like a series of disasters for local communities. Men killed in fields and villages, women left without protection, epidemics spreading in the wake of flight, famine, and unsanitary conditions. Knights who join the elite order command such raids. Their garter is not a harmless ribbon, but a sign of their involvement in this method of warfare. Within England itself, this order also functions as an instrument of pressure. Edward III needs the consent of the nobility for new taxes, for the confiscation of property from those accused of insufficient loyalty, and for the mobilization of people. Membership in the order becomes both a reward and an obligation. Those who are admitted to the symbol of the Garter receive direct access to the king and can count on a share of the spoils, advantageous marriages, and land deals. In exchange, they must be prepared to support the king in controversial decisions, turn a blind eye to the harsh consequences of campaigns on the population, and carry out the king's will in their lands. In legal documents, this looks dry. Lists of grants, confirmations of rights, lists of positions. But behind each line is not only a pen in the chancellery, but also specific decisions about the next recruitment of people for war, about the punishment of those who did not carry out orders, about the distribution of land to those who did not justify the trust. The city crowd is interested in all this in a different way. For craftsmen, merchants, and tavern owners, the Order of the Garter is a distant structure, visible through rare ceremonies, shields in the chapel, and travelers' stories. In their own experience, power and violence manifest themselves through tax collectors, soldiers in armor, epidemics that take away their neighbors, and rising bread prices. For them, the story of the ball and the countess's garter becomes a convenient way of translating incomprehensible politics into the language of the body. It is easier to imagine an awkward moment in the hall than long negotiations about the stakes of a military campaign. It is easier to remember an anecdote about a king who allegedly protects a woman from ridicule than a list of barons and commanders who received medals for ravaging other people's fields. This is how a conflict between two versions of meaning arises. In the official space, statutes, registers, coats of arms, a motto that can be read as a political statement about Edward's right to the French crown and the shame of those who doubt this right. In the realm of conversation, there is a spicy story about a grown king and a grown lady's garter, covering up everything related to the real function of the order. In it, the garter becomes a symbol of courtly protection, not an instrument of discipline. In it, knights are not commanders of destructive campaigns, but idealized participants in dances and tournaments. The city willingly accepts this version because it allows them to talk about supreme power without directly confronting the pain that this power produces. Meanwhile, the war started under Edward weighs heavily on the bodies and minds of his subjects. Waves of plague come to the English shores, killing adult men and women faster than they can be buried. In army camps, diseases spread as quickly as in cities. The chronicles describe how entire detachments died of fevers and intestinal infections before they could even enter battle. In such conditions, the elite order associated with the image of St. George as a heavenly patron also became an instrument of consolation for those who survived. For a knight returning from a campaign, the Garter badge was a reminder not only of loyalty, but also that his suffering was recognized and inscribed in a symbolic order. For widows and orphans left without breadwinners, this order looks much colder. The shields at Windsor, and the bony hands of those holding deeds of debt and confiscation. If we look at the combination of myth and document from a distance, a pattern characteristic of the late Middle Ages emerges. The authorities create a complex institution with a clear military and political function, embed it in architecture, coats of arms, and church rituals, and make it part of the state apparatus. Later, a gentle legend arises around this construct, translating talk of violence and discipline into the register of courtly anecdote. There is no conspiratorial subtlety in this. It is simply a byproduct of the human desire to talk about the terrible in such a way that one can smile. According to surviving documents, Edward III was primarily concerned with ensuring that the Order of the Garter strengthened his power and war. The fact that, many decades later, his order came to be associated with the Countess's garter does not speak to its hidden piquancy, but rather to how readily descendants replaced talk of blood, epidemics, and difficult decisions with talk of fabric on the leg of an adult woman in a hall, which was not mentioned in the sources of his century. The next level of substitution is not random retellings, but the work of court chroniclers and humanist scholars who turn the Order of the Garter into a convenient symbol for a new era. In the 15th and 16th centuries, the English monarchy experienced new crises: dynastic wars, changes of dynasties, and religious schism. In this situation, it was necessary not only to rule the land and the army, but also to explain the past in such a way that it supported the current power. In such texts, Edward III becomes a model of the true Knight King, and the Order of the Garter becomes a visible sign that England is capable of creating its own elites and its own symbols of honor, which are not inferior to those of the continent. This is where the legend came in handy, diverting attention from the specific bodies disfigured by war to the body of a single noblewoman in a well-lit hall. The humanists of the new era were already suspicious of the old knightly chronicles, but they continued to love stories of courtly love and awkward episodes at court. They rewrite old stories, adding moral conclusions and elegant formulas. In such a climate, the story of the Garter easily fits into the broader genre of exemplary anecdotes, where a single gesture of a ruler concentrates his character. The king who lifts the ribbon and utters the phrase in the eyes of such authors demonstrates not so much his mood as his ability to turn shame into honor with a single movement. Documentary evidence about the order itself at this time becomes increasingly routine and dry. The registers list new members, record dates of admission, and describe the costs of repairing the chapel, making insignia, and holding ceremonies. This is the accounting of a state accustomed to living with permanent institutions. For later kings, the Order of the Garter was a legacy, an instrument of honor that could be used to reward generals, favorites, and people whose loyalty was important in the struggle for power. The registers show how both proven military men and courtiers, whose merit was political support or family connections, ended up in the same club. The meaning of the order gradually shifted from a purely military corps to a broader concept of service to the crown. The city, meanwhile, continues to live in a state of rumor. For the residents of London, Windsor, and port cities, what matters is not how precisely the order's charter is formulated, but how it is visible in the urban space. Processions are visible, where adult men in rich robes with garters and the sign of St. George walk alongside the king. They can see the special clothing decorated with enamel, precious stones, and blue ribbons. They can see that people with this sign have different access to power, a different distance from the throne. But the city knows little about the details of the charter, the complex history of Edward III's claim to the French crown, and his campaign. It is much easier and more pleasant to perceive the Garter as a sign of a refined court, where the ruler knows how to combine military valor and gallantry. Some later chroniclers directly reinforce this perception. They describe tournaments, court festivities, and balls held by Edward and his heirs, emphasizing that the Order of the Garter is also a club of people who know how to look good, participate in performances, and demonstrate their wealth in a restrained but noticeable way. In their texts, the order becomes part of a spectacle that the monarchy puts on for itself and for the world. Not only military merits become important, but also the ability to be a model of chivalry. In this world, it is undesirable to remember that the order originated from specific military campaigns involving mass death and destruction, and that the motto could originally have been addressed to those who accused Edward III of usurping someone else's title. The physical experience of that era, however, did not disappear. The same people who admire the shields and ribbons in Windsor live alongside the consequences of the plague, syphilis, and chronic injuries. Descriptions of the burials of victims of epidemics and wars mention how both ordinary soldiers and people from the upper classes were buried. Doctors and scientists of the time tried to explain diseases through fluid balance, harmful miasmas, and lifestyle. Against the backdrop of this constant fear for the body, the gap between the prosperous, even slightly playful image of the order and the real damage suffered by those who bear its insignia becomes particularly noticeable. There are descriptions of knights who participated in campaigns and who, after suffering injuries, became people with limited mobility, chronic pain, and deteriorating health, but who still participated in ceremonies as decorations of the order. The myth of the erotic incident serves another purpose. It softens the image of the monarchy itself. In reality, Edward III and his heirs were people who ordered the execution of rivals, suppressed rebellions, and confiscated land. Court records contain dry accounts of death sentences, severed heads, and bodies hung up as a warning. Financial documents list the proceeds from the sale of the lands of those who were declared traitors. These pages rarely appear in popular retellings. It is much easier to imagine the king in the center of a brightly lit hall, choosing gallantry over revenge, generosity over crude ridicule. The legend of the Garter seems to prove that this power can be gentle and protective, although the actual structure of punishments suggests the opposite. Nevertheless, the state significance of the order did not disappear immediately. In subsequent centuries, membership in it continued to be a sign of the highest trust. In periods of religious conflict, when the choice of confession was at stake, loyalty to the order and the crown meant a willingness to take sides in bloody clashes. During internal crises, those who wear the Garter find themselves in the front row of people who are expected not only to wear beautiful costumes, but also to make concrete decisions, whether to support one candidate or another, whether to suppress a rebellion, whether to agree to a change in the balance of power between the crown and parliament. This shadow function is rarely mentioned in romantic legends, but it is clearly visible if one follows who is actually accepted into the order and for what reasons. At the same time, urban culture continues to feed on a lighter version. Songs, anecdotes, and later plays mention the order more as a sign of elegance and courtliness than as an instrument of discipline. In them, the Garter lives alongside images of tournaments, courtly romances, and gallant gestures. The street chooses this image because it is convenient. It allows one to distance oneself from statehood, turning its symbol into an object of semi-playful ridicule. Just as other countries distance themselves from heavy orders by giving them colloquial nicknames, English society eagerly whispers stories about the Countess of Salisbury and the awkwardness in the hall, even if these stories are based on texts written decades after the events. As a result, two layers coexist in the same symbol. On one level, the Order of the Garter remains part of the official machinery of loyalty. Lists, ceremonies, places in the choir, coats of arms on the walls. On another level, there is the anecdote about the Garter, which serves the need to see something human, physical, almost comical in this symbol. Between them lies the familiar rift between late medieval and early modern society. Documents record violence, coercion, and calculation, while oral and literary myths tell stories of casual gestures and beautiful phrases that supposedly explain the entire structure of power. It is in this divide that the enduring image of the Order of the Garter is formed as something both spicy and prestigious, where the fabric on an adult woman's leg covers discipline, blood, and political calculation, recorded in the same centuries by the hand of a scribe in a cold office. The further away from the time of Edward III, the more freely the legend lives its own life. In urban tavern stories and cheap pamphlets of the new era, the Garter increasingly appears as an almost intimate detail rather than a belt of armor. The story of the Countess of Salisbury begins to be embellished with details that were never in the early texts. Descriptions of the dress, the color of the ribbon, the reaction of the courtiers, and hints that cannot be verified. For masters of street and tavern literature, this is convenient material. Through the body of an adult noblewoman, it is safe to talk about the physicality of power itself, without risking direct criticism of the king or his heirs. The laughter surrounding the Garter becomes a way to momentarily reduce the distance to those who wear crowns and orders. But at the same time, at the level of real politics, no mechanism of coercion remains untouched. Official monarchical culture responds to this in its own way. In ceremonial portraits and descriptions of ceremonies, the garter and the insignia of the order are gradually cleansed of any hints. They are presented as symbols of ancient honor, loyalty, and knightly virtues. The motto of the order, which in the mythical scene sounds like a retort, is associated not with the episode in the hall, but with the abstract idea of loyalty to the cause, the crown, and the state. Treatises on pious rulers emphasize that true honor requires standing by the legitimate monarch, even when everything around is falling apart. During religious conflicts, dynastic changes, or the threat of invasion, the garter becomes a symbol on the mantle of a general, a minister, and later a colonial administrator who must embody the stability of the empire. Where the streets still whisper stories of an awkward ball, the official language now speaks of pure loyalty and service to the common good. This gap is especially noticeable when the order is used as a tool for open PR. During the era of imperial expansion, the garter was awarded not only to descendants of the medieval nobility, but also to people whose power was based on the subjugation of distant territories, wars in foreign countries, and the suppression of uprisings. Newspapers and speeches emphasized their loyalty to the crown and their knightly steadfastness, describing the award as an act of recognition of their services to the state. At the level of urban memory, such gestures were superimposed on an old legend and created a disturbing effect. The same symbol that was once associated with an awkward scene at court now adorned people who made decisions about war, taxes, and repression. The city crowd habitually clung to the vulgar version, not because they believed in its historical accuracy, but because it provided at least some emotional protection against a symbol that increasingly signified access to the levers of violence and the distribution of other people's lives. If we lay out all the layers of this story side by side, it becomes clear how little in it is accidental. At the bottom lie dry documents from the 14th century, the order's charter, lists of knights, chapel expenses, records of war, taxes, and confiscations. Above are chronicles in which Edward III is portrayed as a warrior king, teaching his subjects to live in the shadow of his claim to the French crown. Even higher up are the humanists and court writers who need a beautiful story about a wise ruler. The top layer consists of urban retellings, cheap pamphlets, and tourist legends of later times, where only a garter and a phrase taken out of context remain. Each new floor takes us further away from the moment when the order was a tool for controlling armed adult men and their resources, and pushes us towards a picture in which power is explained by an awkward gesture in a lit hall. In this sense, the myth of the erotic incident performs a very modern function. It transforms an institution associated with war, taxation, repression, and elite discipline into a safe object of curiosity. One can discuss with interest whether the garter really fell from Countess Salisbury's leg, whether it was blue or another color, who exactly was present in the hall, argue about what the king really meant, and at the same time not touch on the question of why a closed knightly club was created at all under a monarch waging a protracted war. The documentary line of the order as an instrument of loyalty is supplanted by the line of the order as a trace of an amusing episode, although it was the former that determined the lives of the people whose names and bodies are associated with this symbol. The decisions that led to this substitution were made not by abstract forces, but by very specific adults. Edward III and his advisors consciously created the order to unite a circle of influential commanders and magnates through a common symbol, rituals, and motto. Later, kings decided who to admit to this club, who to rely on in wars and crises, and who to remove from the circle by taking their shield off the wall. Court writers chose which story to tell about the past: a story about battlefields and confiscations, or a story about garters. Urban storytellers chose which image of power was easier to live with: a heavy symbol of violence or a slightly vulgar anecdote that allowed people to laugh at those who held the levers of punishment in their hands. Each of these choices gradually shifted the center of gravity, from the order as an instrument of political control to the order as an almost theatrical symbol that could be viewed on portraits and souvenirs. At the same time, the motto of the order, which outlived the king who created it, remains attached to the state. Over time, it has become less and less associated with the garter of any particular woman, and more with the abstract honor of the state, the steadfastness of the monarchy, and the historical mission. It appears on the coat of arms, in official texts, and in ceremonies where the award is given to people responsible for modern wars and political decisions. For them, the Order of the Garter is not a legend about Countess Salisbury, but a state sign of recognition, part of the public showcase of power. The city continues to whisper the old story out of inertia, but the real consequences of this choice are visible not in the ballroom, but in the lists of awardees, in the minutes of meetings, in the footage of repressed riots and distant campaigns, where the order serves as a marker of belonging to the highest echelons of the pyramid. From a historical point of view, it is precisely this combination of myth and document that makes the history of the Order of the Garter disturbing. It shows how easily society agrees to replace talk of mechanisms of coercion and loyalty with talk of fabric and awkwardness. How willingly the elite itself pushes such a story to soften the image of its institutions. How readily the city clings to the spicy version because it allows it to look at the sign of supreme power without the coldness that comes from the real lists of those executed, ruined, and sent to endless wars. The motto, which later retellings link to the defense of female honor, was in the original political environment a way to respond to accusations of usurpation and to consolidate the circle of those willing to share responsibility for aggressive campaigns. In the end, there is neither debunking nor triumph. The Order of the Garter continues to exist as part of British state symbolism, and its insignia is still worn by decision-makers on whom the lives of others depend. The legend of the Countess's Garter lives on in tours, popular texts, and tourist routes, covering up a long history of choosing an elite club associated with war and discipline. The denouement of this chronicle is not a revealing gesture, but an understanding. The meaning of a symbol is never set once and for all. It is changed by the people who talk about it and use it. At some point, the adult audience of Europe preferred to see the Garter primarily as a reason for an anecdote, rather than a reminder of the belt that held armor together and forced knights to pay for royal ambitions with their bodies and the bodies of their people. And it is precisely this choice, to leave the right to explain the symbol to myth rather than to a document, that makes the history of the Order of the Garter not a light-hearted legend about awkwardness, but a lesson in how willingly power and society together mask discipline, blood, and duty under a piece of fabric that once fell to the floor at an imaginary ball